It's like you said, there are no trick questions. You either know it or you don't.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're talking about the Disabled Persons Act, that's 1973 or 1968, but you need to know those and when they came into play, because it could be that they're saying, oh, the Disabled Persons Act of 1988. Well, it was way before 1988. So something's going on there within that question.
Well, hello and welcome to the ADA Shop Talk podcast. I'm your host, Paul Klein. And if you are an ADA coordinator, government official, architect, or accessibility specialist trying to better understand the ADA, then you are in the right place. The ADA Shop Talk podcast is brought to you by BlueDag. Check out BlueDag's Transition Plan Builder and Inspection Suite over at bluedag.com. And thank you so much for tuning in. I got another great guest for you today. Someone I've known for a while, and I think you're going to really enjoy, especially if you want some top secret tips on studying for the CASp exam. Hence today's title is, where did my title go? See, there I go. I'm already goofing on this thing. There's my title. Study smart, not hard. Top tips for crushing the CASp exam with Lorena Soules. Lorena, you are a CBO and a CASp and a great friend and guest today. How are you doing? Welcome to the ADA Shop Talk podcast.
Hi, Paul. How are you? Thanks for having me. I'm doing well and happy to be here.
Yeah. Excuse me. I kind of glossed over your resume and everything, but man, you've worked your way from, I think, a permit technician all the way to a CBO running your own building department, and you're heavily involved in accessibility. I mean, you got all kinds of certifications, but man, how long have you been in the code business or a code official?
Well, I've been in the building industry for a little over 25 years. Started, just like you said, as a permit technician, and then later became a plans examiner. During the time as becoming a plans examiner, that's kind of how I fell into accessibility and started learning more about it. And then just becoming passionate about it because, my mom's losing her vision. My uncle uses a wheelchair. So you have a little bit of better understanding. And so I just kind of went down that road and then kept studying. And then here I am today, building official.
I know our paths are so parallel because I started out working the front counter, doing over-the-counter plan review, and then eventually became a CBO and running my own building department, had a staff of like 20 and all those fun headaches. I can say that now. So our paths are very similar, but we both, and Mark too. Mark, Mark Wood, my partner in CASp, he was building official for 28 or 30 years for the city of Davis. And, but we all three, the one area that we all like gravitated to is this accessibility and the CASp and all that stuff. So what did it for you? Why such an interest in accessibility, other than, I mean, you've got some family that might've pushed you that way, but clearly you were into it long before that. Why was that?
I think it's just about, learning the code and just diving into learning something new. When I was doing plan review, I was doing residential plan review, and my building official then was like, hey, just want to let you know this CASp thing has come up. And when you do intake at the counter, it might be that permit technicians need to know about accessibility in order to intake an application. I was like, oh, okay, well, let me read that. Let me see what it's about. So I started reading that. And then one of my colleagues, who is now my business partner, he's like, oh, Lorena, I just took the exam. It's really hard. It's so hard, but he's like, you got to know 5 titles of the ADA. You got to know this and that. And I was like, oh my God. And then I was like, do I really want to go down this road? But I was like, hell yeah, I'm up for the challenge.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what started it. So then I pivoted into doing some commercial plan reviews with Val, my business partner, with his leadership, and he just kind of guided me down the road. And through that, I just started learning a little bit more, diving deeper into the code. But one of the things as a code official, and this is one of the things I'd like for people to know who are code officials and trying to prepare for the CASp exam, is to kind of take that code official hat off and think of yourself as a private consultant CASp, because that can kind of hinder your progress when you're preparing for the exam in many ways. And we can discuss that as we go down more conversation here. But yeah, it's one of those things.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Cause that's a trap. You know, we train a lot of code officials and they're so almost like blinders. You know, I only have to deal with this. And then if there's a subset of that, I'm only dealing with plan check. I don't think about the field. And then, or if I'm in the field, I don't worry about plan check. But to be a certified access specialist, you got to be a specialist, not a generalist. And I think that is so true. That really does hinder us code officials. But what are some other, well, before we get to some more tips, I want to ask you this question about, I hear this gripe a lot and I want to get your perspective. Why do you think the CASp exam is so hard or so difficult? Everybody says it's so darn difficult. It's harder than the PE exam or harder than the architect exam, but what's your perspective on that? What is it hard and why is that, do you think?
I think that's really funny because even, when my colleague was sharing with me, oh my God, I took it. It's so hard. I I studied really, really hard. Did a grueling study process. And when I took the open book exam, I finished it with 30 minutes left over.
Oh,
And I just
wow.
didn't feel like it was that hard. And, one of the things you said when I took your CalCast training a long time ago, you had said something like, don't study the night before. You know what you know, right? And if you don't know it the night before, you're not gonna know it.
Right.
And that resonated with me. And so I knew that I knew what I knew, and I knew that I was gonna pass that open book test. And when I finished with 30 minutes left over, I was like, okay, wow. And and I'll go into share some how I got there, because I talked to a lot of people, and other than a couple of my mentors, nobody finished with time left over. The
Yeah.
people that I talked to, they're like, oh my God, I was down to the last minute. And so I can really share some tips on how to get that speed and just kind of get through the whole open book test. Studying for the closed book test, that was hard.
Yeah.
That was hard. So open book, not so much, but closed book, that was hard. And it's because you really need to know the differences between the laws, acts are laws, and standards are adopted guidelines. And you need to know these differences when you're reading these questions, especially in the closed book, because they're so detailed. The question is so detailed, and they're like a paragraph, 5, 6, 7 sentences long.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of know what nuggets to pick out of there. And then, of course, you have 4 answers that you got to pick from. So you have to really understand what they're asking in order to pick the best answer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important, because there's what they call the distractors inside of the question. The building is blue and their uncle's best friend bought it. Well, it doesn't have anything to do with it. It's a public accommodation. Okay, now we're talking. Oh, readily achievable barrier removal, so getting those, being able to hone in on those nuggets. And I think that's the same mistake I made when I took it, is like, oh, I know grab bars and blue borders. I know the CBC, I know 11B. And I went and took it and I bombed it the first time because I didn't have a full grasp of the federal housing and, program access and all the other stuff that came along with it. So after I took that first test, it really opened my eyes. And I think Mark set me up because he said, yeah, you go take it and tell me how it is. And so I go, Mark, we got a little more studying to do. And I think I was his guinea pig, to be honest. No, I'm joking when I say that.
It's funny is like just you saying readily achievable barrier removal. Well, that to me is a building constructed before the ADA.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you have something constructed after the enactment of the ADA, you don't have readily achievable barrier removal. You need to be in compliance at the time it was built.
Right.
So those are different things that when you study, you learn. So I think it was great. When I took my closed book test, I failed it by 1 point. And Val, I remember him saying, like, he's like, "Oh my God, I thought you were going to be so upset." And I was so excited. I was like, "Oh my God, I feel very employed. That's so great. That means I'm learning, and that means I'm going to pass it the next time."
Yep.
And I
Yes.
did, thankfully, right?
Yeah.
But I guess it's how you spin it. And it was really, for me, studying for the CASp exam was such a great journey and such a great experience because I got to network, meet so many cool people. At that time, my boss, I was in Garden Grove, and my boss was really supportive. So he sent me to like the DSA CASp 101 after I took that training, which I think is really important. And anybody that's going to take the CASp exam really should take the DSA CASp 101 because what I did with the material that they give you, just a handout of what they're teaching you. I actually took that handout and I broke it down, all the Senate bills, all the assembly bills, and made flashcards. I hand wrote all my flashcards, front and back, front and back. And that just helped me so much and it helped me have a better understanding. And then I think it was like the following week, I signed up for your class in Sacramento for the
Yeah.
CalCASP, and I took that in Sacramento. And that was great because when I was there, it was Matt, I met Tammy, I met Russ
Hmm.
and me, and we're like, hey, we're all from the Long Beach area, man. Let's create a study group. Let's
Yeah.
do this exam together. It was so cool. So we started meeting once a week until we all took the exam at the same time. And every time we met, we brought something new. Each one of us, like Matt would bring a plan, and we'd all sit and scope it for 2 hours. I brought my training was I bought all the Senate bills. I brought little snippets. So we would put up like Senate Bill 1608, 1186. And then I mixed up all the bullet points and we'd have to put them underneath which Senate bill it was.
Yeah.
And we all had our own game. And so then at the end, we all checked our work and we're like, oh man, I got that wrong. Oh man, I got this right. Or how'd you remember that? So it was fun. And I think when you make the studying fun, it makes it easier to comprehend. And your with your study group, you're able to bounce things off, and it's kind of like a safe place because you're like, oh my God, they're gonna know I don't know this.
Yeah, but
So
that's the continuous learning, and I think if you treat it like it's like a discovery. Like each time you discover something new, it's like oh, how does this work or how does that work? And even to this day, I still run across those scenarios or those situations. Like I got a question the other day about the cross slope inside of an ambulatory stall. Now we all just assume, oh, it's got to be 2% or less, but what's the code path? So I start digging into the code and accessible routes. There's really nothing there. Toilet rooms. Well, no, it refers back to 213 or something. And there's just really no clear code path. And I finally ended up on door maneuvering space. So each side of the door has to have via the doors. It's not in the toilet room section. And anyway, so no matter how long you're doing this, and my point is, and I think that's what you're alluding to, is continuous learning and being optimistic about it is your biggest asset, as opposed to, oh, I missed one, I'm a failure. No, man, you almost passed. You're going to nail it the next time, turn it into a positive, and continuous learning. So
yeah, and even I took one of your other trainings in Ontario because yet another training, and I was at that time stalking you and Mark. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to learn everything they know, and then I'm going to pass this exam.
and you did.
um, I did. I stalked your ADA podcast. That was part of my study.
I know. I remember seeing you with all these flashcards, and then you had like a diagram with all of like the history of all the federal and state codes on one sheet. And I was like just amazed because I knew a lot of it, but there was a lot of things on there that you had that I didn't think about. Unruh Act was in, you had all kinds of cool stuff in there. And, I'm sure that took hours for you to put together, but if we could summarize some of the tips and tricks you did. Obviously you said flashcards, study group, but what else? What are some key things that you did? You either elaborate more on those or what else? What are some other tips that you would give people that are studying for the Certified Access Specialist program in California?
So one of the things, as part of my studies, I listened to a lot of podcasts, and your guys' at the time, your historical podcasts that I continually ask, what are you going to bring them back? But what I liked about them is because those actually helped me more prepare for the closed book exam, because you had a lot of scoping for what would be the closed book exam, and not so much, the code book. What I also did was, I told you I wrote out all my flashcards. My flashcards, I did acronyms. I did flashcards for state codes. I did flashcards for federal codes. I did flashcards for Senate bills and Assembly bills. And so what I did was I ended up recording myself reading all those flashcards, on one recording, all the flashcards, but in that order, I did acronyms and then state bills, federal bills. And then when I would drive to work, I had a 40-minute commute one way. So I was either listening to a podcast, or I was listening to I was listening to my recordings of all my flashcards, because I can't be reading my flashcards while I'm driving. Right. So I would just be continually repeating that, and like, what is a covered multifamily? And then, reading that definition, and just when was the ADA enacted? And also, like, when was the ABA enforced? The California, Government Code 4450, all those different, reading all those within my flashcards. And that really helped me. I think one of the other things that really resonated with me when I was being mentored by Val, he said, Lorena, only go where the code takes you. And I think that's so important when people are studying for the open book exam, is to only go where the code takes you, rather than going straight to Division 3 and 10 where all the technical is.
Yeah.
Really start in Division 2 where your scoping is, and then only go where the code takes you. Because you can, a good example, and I think you've used this analogy before, is benches. So benches are only required, in certain locations, dressing room, fitting room, locker rooms. But they're also, if it's provided in saunas or steam rooms, then they need to comply with benches, right? So if you're taking an exam and it's for a hotel, let's say, and they say, oh, what is the scoping for this bench? What are the requirements for this bench in this hotel lobby? And then you go straight to the technical to find the information for the benches, then you've missed the whole point, because you didn't start in the scoping.
Yeah.
Knowing that, guess what? There is no, you don't enforce anything for benches in a hotel lobby, so those are the things that you really have to be mindful is you're only going where the code takes you.
Yeah, that's so important. There's so many times we, as a consultant, you can make recommendations. As an architect, you can make best practices. Maybe the hotel should follow the Chapter 3, but to become a certified access specialist by DSA and pass the exam, you have to follow the code path. And if there's no code, if it's not scoped, then on the exam, doesn't mean the bench shouldn't be accessible, or there shouldn't be other reasons why someone might want to make it accessible, but it's understanding that for the exam and the regulatory perspective that it's not scoped. It's like we see a lot of, I'm sure you're dealing with this as a CBO in your jurisdiction, there's a lot of pre-91 buildings being converted from previous occupancies into multifamily for the homeless. And so what always comes up is, it's public housing, but do we apply adaptability? Well, no, it's a pre-91 building and it's not scoped. It was built for first occupancy for something other than multifamily. And understanding those nuances, I think, is so important that you're pointing out there. So that's great, Lorena. And what else do you have? So you've got flashcards, you did podcasts, you did a study group. Actually, let me ask you this before we get to any other tips that'll come up. Knowing what you know now about all this, as a code official, you're 20-something years of doing this and being a CASp, why is accessibility such a difficult subject in California? there's no right or wrong answer. Just from your perspective, why is it so difficult to get to the answers that we need to, whether we're code official, business owner, architect, or whatever? I mean, I hear that all the time. It's so difficult to find the right answers, but why do you think that is?
Well, from my perspective, I think being in the code industry, I think because we're automatically trained to rely on the code, you know. Um, but I think as a CASp, an independent CASp, taking your code official hat off once again, right? I think you also bring in litigation and just other things that are broader. So maybe things that aren't really in the code. And remember that the ADA is actually written into the code. So Chapter 11B is based on the 2010 ADAS. And I think still even code officials forget they think they're applying a code, but really they are actually applying the law, the actual act.
Right.
And I think that we forget that when they can't get to an answer as a CAS, as a code official, if you can't get to an answer, we don't open our minds in the code world to think outside the box and to bring in different case studies that have, which is like Corolla or the Lomita had some on-street parking,
right,
some litigation there. And so there are some laws that you could actually use to rely on to kind of make a determination. But I think as code officials, they kind of forget that. And then I think if you're acting as a CASp, an independent CASp, if you have that hat on, then you have a broader scope.
Yeah, no, that makes.
So I don't know if that really answered your question.
No, it does. I think because sometimes we fall into what I call the code ranger mentality, and it's just it's black and white, 36 inches, and then other people I've had on this podcast, had some great people who work in the disability advocacy space, and obviously when there's a doubt, we want to provide greater access. And so sometimes code officials can feel like they're over applying the code or they're overstepping their boundaries. But to your point, it's a civil rights law that, yes, built-in elements aren't regulated, but if you have temporary plastic tables in front of your coffee shop, you need to have accessible seating. So it's still, I don't know. And that's why Mark and I teach the whole equal thing, and we advocate thinking outside the box more and not just bare minimum code, but what's going to provide the greatest degree of access to the greatest number of people with the greatest number of disabilities. It's not going to capture everybody, but yeah, I think as code officials, they oftentimes just gloss over that piece or just don't want to deal with it, And I've been there. You got energy code, zoning, board of supervisors, city council breathing down your necks. Get plan checks out faster. Pro development. Oh, building falls down. Wait, we need more regulation. So there's all those nuances too. So let me ask you this too, Lorena. Let's talk about scoping. You mentioned scoping in chapter 2 of the building code or the ADAS, but the broader scoping. So knowing what you know now that you've studied for a CASp exam and you know kind of the more swath of the profession, share your thoughts on kind of the broader scoping that you need to know to pass the exam. If there's any tips you have there in terms of scenarios or anything that comes to mind in terms of scoping on the broader sense, not just chapter 2.
Well, I mean, just knowing what the laws are and knowing what you're reading. Like you're in the exam, the closed book exam, and you're reading, maybe the question is the Code of Federal Regulations 36 requires all state and local governments to provide a transition plan and have it in place for so many years. It could go on and on. These are long sentences within the exam. And then you have your multiple choice questions. Well, if you see that the Code of Federal Regulations, the CFR 36, and they're talking about transition plans in the same sentence, that should be a red flag, right? So you should already know what you're looking for within those 4 questions below. First of all, the Code of Federal Regulations 36 relates to Title III, which is public accommodations. And transition plans relates to Title II, so which is state and local governments. So you would need to pick the best answer out of those four and think about the scoping when it comes to the laws, whether it's the Architectural Barriers Act or the Disabled Persons Act. And it's actually knowing when the years, those dates that came into play, because some of the questions on the exam, they could and it's like you said, there are no trick questions. You either know it or you don't.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're talking about the Disabled Persons Act, that's 1973 or 1968, but you need to know those and when they came into play, because it could be that they're saying, oh, the Disabled Persons Act of 1988. Well, it was way before 1988. So something's going on there within that question.
Yeah.
So that's just the bigger picture, and just knowing the states and laws and what they were enacted for. I think like a good example of that is the Fair Housing Act. So when the Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, didn't include disabilities. And then it was amended in 1988 to include disabilities. So you need to know those on that bigger level, and then to be able to take the exam.
Yeah.
The closed book, that I wish somebody would have told me, hey, you don't have to take the open book and the closed book at the same time. But everybody I knew did. And I was like, oh my God, I got to sign up for both of them. But everybody that I work with, and they're like, hey, can you kind of, help me, guide me through this studying process? In fact, one of my plans examiners here, we just had this conversation this morning. She's like, oh, I gotta, study. How should I start studying? And I was like, well, first of all, you're only going to take one exam first, and you're going to take the open book. And she's already a plans examiner. So, she's a quarter of the way there.
Yeah.
I told her the first thing she's going to need to do is just break down all the acronyms, because when she's reading the questions in the exam, they use a lot of acronyms. If you don't know what those acronyms are, it's going to be so hard.
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah. The government loves their acronyms. So
yeah,
that's a great place to start. I like that tip, start with the acronyms and just focus on the closed book first.
Yeah. And that's huge, because, it'll help to build your confidence too. If you pass that exam, then, you're halfway there, right?
Yeah.
So you're good to go. Now you can focus your studies. As part of one of your on CASp, as part of one of your training modules, I took the advanced scoping. That really, really helped me. So I think there's other resources out there, love CASp, but there's other resources out there as well. And so, but anything that helps you with that advanced scoping, that helps people break down the questions and to better understand what is being asked, all those resources are helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, that's super, super helpful. And I think, just to, clarify, the closed book is more like, what's the height of a grab bar? What's the minimum turning radius in a toilet room? It's more kind of like a traditional ICC or kind of closed book exam, multiple guess. Whereas the open book is more, you could have plans, you're going to have copies of regulations, you might have a little more scoping involved in that possibly. Is that fair to say? It's been a while since.
No, I feel like that's backwards.
Is it? Okay.
The open book, you have plans, you have door schedules, you have site plans, you have sections, you have everything that you would have, in a set of plans. They give you the code book there, all the material that you're going to need to take the exam. But it's specific to California. It's specific to just what's in that code book for that specific project type, right? Where I felt the closed book was largely on housing, knowing the differences between the Fair Housing Act Design Manual, knowing the differences between that and the 11A. There was, to me, it was much bigger versus the the open book. I
Yeah.
felt like the open book was, if you study and you learn scoping from Division 2 in the code book, you'll glide right through the open book test.
Yeah.
But really what was hard was that closed book. So I had
Yeah.
to really dig deep with that one.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's right. And that's where they would put the or full paragraph scoping. You had a building built in 1962. It was a restaurant. In 1982, they added a parking lot, an additional 12 stalls. Then they did an entrance ramp in 1992 as part of their, it goes on and on like that. And it's not just what's the height of a grab bar and accessible toilet room and an accessible water closet toilet. It's very, that gray area of that scoping, is hits there. And I think actually when I took it and passed, they didn't have the 2 tests. It was 1 test still at the time, or it was.
And yours was all closed book, right?
I think so. I think it was before they made that change. So mine and Mark's go way back. I'm number 68 and he's number 48 or 42 or something like that. So we're.
Oh yeah, you guys go way back. So. I have a colleague who's like in the 200s, and his was still all closed book even. And so, how you indicated where they asked the height of the grab bars, and they asked all those technicals. Now that's changed since there's the 2 exams, because now that's just limited to the open book.
Yeah.
And I think with that being said, the way the exam is, hosted now, it could be harder, because with the closed book portion, I think it's harder for the closed book portion just because you're really relying on your memory, and it's really going to be challenging, because you have to really know a lot about all the laws and the guidelines and the standards and knowing the difference between them.
Yeah.
Just like I was saying, like acts are laws, and then the like Americans with Disabilities Act, that's a federal law. And then where you have guidelines like the 2010 ADAS standard, that was a guidelines, and once it was a guideline, and then when it got adopted, it became the standard.
Right.
So now here we are with PROAG, right?
Yeah.
The G is the guideline.
Yeah.
So now when it has an S and it's PROAGs, it'll be a standard.
Yeah. Well, but the ironic thing is it becomes a standard by default, because when the DOT or the DOJ comes and sues your jurisdiction, they say, well, unless you've developed your own guidelines, you better follow these federal ones because they're the best available. So it becomes a standard.
It becomes a standard by default. Absolutely. And so most jurisdictions should be, and if they're not, they should be referencing those,
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the other day, I made an announcement on the podcast recently about the DOJ just put out website and app accessibility standards that are coming in 2025 and 2027 for small and large jurisdictions. So basically, website accessibility has always been follow the WC3, whatever, again.
Yeah. I forget the acronym.
Yeah. It's very, it's WAG for wild ass. Whoops. I don't know if I can say that on the podcast. I guess I just did. A wild blank guess. And that's kind of the nature of guidelines. They're not standards yet. They haven't been vetted, but with websites, it's always been really like, kind of that gray area. Well, now they are going to officially have standards for local government, which means that it's probably going to come to the public sector and public accommodations a few years after that would be my guess. So that's.
Yeah, I did hear you mention that. And then, in fact, I think I got an email from the U.S. Access Board, because I'm on a bunch of different emails. I get emails from different, like Pacific ADA and different things. And I think I got an email stating that, and I was like, oh, this will be interesting. We can get some training on that, and definitely want to share that with my IT people and make sure they're aware of what's coming down the line, right?
Yeah, definitely. Very important for ADA coordinators and local government, because it's only a year away depending on your size. I think the larger you are, I think the large, like City LA and those big jurisdictions, it's 2027. Smaller you are, the sooner it is. So good stuff. But I also wanted to ask you, probably last question here. I know you got a department to manage, and I want to be respectful of your time. But what are some other organizations you've worked with? I know you've been involved with a lot of code organizations and everything, but I just wanted to have you talk about some of those that you're involved in, and any resources that might be interest to some of the listeners.
Well, some of the organizations were, I was sitting on the board of CASI, not anymore, but just I got too busy to, it's volunteer, and well, that was a lot of fun. You get to connect with a lot of great board members, and your network grows, and you just meet a lot of good people all trying to make a positive impact in the built environment. And so I was part of that for some time. And then right now, I'm currently sitting on the ICC LA Basin chapter Disability Access Committee. So I chair that committee, and we meet every third Wednesday every month. And so it's just a bunch of code officials that get together that are members of the ICC LA Basin chapter. And all of us are CASp generally, but then there are others that can attend. And I encourage and invite anybody who listens to your show and wants to participate, just reach out to me, because we'd love to have you participate and just grow your knowledge, and especially if you're in the code industry, because it's more geared to code officials.
Right. And is that via Zoom, or is that in person at a coffee shop, or how?
It's generally on Zoom. It just turns out that it's easier to meet for everybody's schedule on Zoom than to try and get away from the office. So, yeah, it's just on Zoom.
Okay. Well, if you have a link for that, I'd love to include that in the show notes, or I can have them email you, whichever you're comfortable with. You already gave me permission to share your email, so I'll definitely put Lorena's email and LinkedIn profile in the show notes. But would you have a link for that as well for that code group?
Yeah, I could probably get that and send that over to you. But or else they could just email me. That's fine, and then I'll just forward it to the committee, and they'll because they put it in the Zoom, and it gets like auto sent out. So
okay.
We'll make sure they get included. That's for sure.
Well,
we're trying to grow that committee.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I might have to dial into that and tune in.
Come on.
Well, Lorena, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I knew you'd be a great guest to talk about the CASp exam. I'll have Lorena's email in there if you have any questions. I know this is California specific, but this is good information. I've had a lot of requests for information on the CASp exam, so I'll also include the DSA page that has some information on that too. So, Lorena, thank you so much. You've been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
All right, we'll do it again soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.